Hi everybody, this is going to be our notes on quadratic functions, and if you notice that little sticky note there says remember. So my hope is that as we are taking these notes today, a lot of it comes back from last year, or as I'm writing these keywords and steps, we remember that this is something that we did learn last year in 9th grade. If not, no worries at all. Perfect opportunity to have all of us get on the same page with what we know about quadratic functions and solving them. So here we have our standard form, which again from our day 1 notes means that it's highest power to lowest. So I see x squared and then x, so highest to lowest. Methods of solving a quadratic equation. So if you have your highlighter, it would be good to highlight this. We have 3 methods. Method number 1 is solving by square roots. Number 2 is the quadratic formula. Which, if we remember, is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all divided by 2a. And then last but not least, our third method is factoring. So over the course of this unit, we will be learning and practicing all 3 of these methods with real-world scenarios, ultimately. Today, though, we are going to focus on solving by square roots, so that very first method we wrote. Focusing on this one. So let's discuss when and how we solve by square roots. We solve by square roots when there is no b term. So if I write that standard general form, f of x equals ax squared plus bx plus c, we're saying when this term is not there. So for example, let's say just 8x squared plus 64. Notice I've got the ax squared term, so here a would be 8, but I do not have a middle term. There is no plus 2x or minus 5x. We just have the constant at the end. There's no middle term. For the how, we have 2 steps. Step 1 will be to isolate the squared variable term, isolate the squared variable term, or we could just say, make this simpler, isolate the variable, which is going to be x squared. So that's what we meant by isolate the squared variable. So once we isolate the variable x squared, we are going to take the square roots of both sides. We have our process. Let's practice. Number 1 says solve each of the following quadratic equations. As always, let's put a line down our equal sign. So let's see. step 1 said to isolate the variable. Well, here x squared is already by itself. So straight away, I can take the square root of both sides. So I take the square root of this side, and I take the square root of this side, and I get x equals, who remembers the square root of 81? I'm hoping it's coming back to us that it's 9. Remember though that I actually get two answers, plus or minus 9. And our because, for y we have plus minus. So plus minus because 9 squared. So if I plug back into my original, 9 squared is 81. And negative 9 squared is also 81. So whenever we're solving and we take a square root, we will always get a plus minus result. Number 2, line down our equal sign. First step, isolate the variable x squared. So here we have a z, but it's the same idea. So 3z squared. This z squared is not by itself yet, and it says 3 times that. What is the opposite of multiplying? Well, the opposite of multiplying is dividing. So we will divide both sides by 3. That gets me z squared equals 6. Now that the squared term is by itself, we can take the square root of both sides, and we get as an answer z equals, so the square and the square root cancel each other out. I can't take the square root of 6 and get an exact answer, so I will leave it just like that instead of getting the decimal, but I will make sure I remember that it's plus or minus. We get 2 answers. Notice in numbers 1 and 2, there was no term that looked like this. We had no b term anywhere. Same thing here. I have a squared term and a constant. Squared term, these are all constants. We're able to solve by square roots because we have no middle term to deal with. Number 3, w squared is what I'm paying attention to. To get that squared term by itself, we will divide both sides by negative 4. If you haven't gotten out your calculator, go ahead and grab it, press pause. So we'll do negative 305 divided by negative 4, and we get w squared equals, negative divided by negative is a positive, so I get 76.25. And if you did not try this in your calculator, please pause the video and go get your calculator so you can try it yourself. Now that w squared is by itself, to eliminate that square, the opposite of squaring is square rooting. So I will take the square root of both sides. Now this, I'm going to use my calculator to keep going. To get the square root button, if you look for the key on your for the x squared key on your calculator, you'll see that right above it is a square root symbol. So to get that, you need to hit second and then hit x squared, and that should get you the square root button on your calculator. And we will enter in 76.25, close the parentheses, hit enter, and we should get w equals plus or minus 8.732, and it keeps going, but I'll just round it to 3 decimal places. Looking at number 4, what's different about number 4? Well, this is the first time we see addition involved. The steps haven't changed though. My goal, my priority is going to be to isolate that squared variable. So here I have x squared plus 6. So we know from our prior knowledge that the inverse of adding is subtracting, so we will subtract 6 from both sides. And we get x squared equals negative 7. I check the square term is completely by itself. So now to eliminate the square, the opposite or the inverse of squaring is taking the square root. So we will take the square root of both sides. Can I take the square root of a negative number? We will explore why we can't take the square root of a negative in the future. I'm hoping from last year we remember that we can't do that. So I'll put square root of negative 7, but then I'm going to say no solution. Because this is actually an imaginary. We use that word today in class. We see the square root of a negative, that's an imaginary number. Very good. Let's do one more. We're going to end tonight's flipped notes with number 5. So as always, line down the equal sign. Remember our steps. 1, isolate the squared term. I will generally represent that with x squared. So we're going to isolate the squared term. And 2, take the square root of both sides. So for number 5, we actually have a couple things to do. I'm going to first ask myself, well, where is the squared term? And I look and it's right there. So I really don't care what's on the right side. I'm paying attention to this left side. My first question is there something I could add or subtract? Well, I see this negative 60, and so I can add 60 to both sides. So we're going to be using a lot of our prior knowledge solving skills here. That leaves me 20y squared equals 20. So now I have 20y squared. Remember that this is actually 20 times y squared, so to undo multiplication, we will divide both sides by 20. What does that leave behind? Got y squared equals 20 divided by 20 is 1. So as of this step, I have successfully accomplished step 1 of isolating the x squared term. So step 1, check. Now that I've isolated the squared term, next I will take the square root of both sides, because that's how we undo squaring. It's the inverse of squaring. So I've got the square root of 1. 1 is a perfect square. Square root of 1 is 1. So my two answers are y equals plus or minus 1, and I am all done with number 5. It's very nice if we could box our final answers. It's a good habit. So step 1 was to isolate. Step 2, in this very same place, we also took the square root of both sides to finish it up. That ends our flipped notes for tonight. Tomorrow in class, we will pick up with practicing on numbers 7 through 18 as our in-class practice. Nice job. If you do get started on any of these, if you have a little extra time, that would be great. Please send me any questions on Remind. Have a good night.